All right. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you are tuning in today. My name is Luke Baumgartner. I am a research fellow with the program on extremism at George Washington University. Today I'm joined by Dr. John Horgan, a professor at Georgia State University and multi-time author of excellent books on terrorism and psychology. Today we are here to talk about the intersection of those two topics and talk about terrorist psychology as it applies to our study of terrorism and how we understand terrorism as a phenomenon. Now, oftentimes I don't do our panelists justice by reading their bio, so I will allow John to introduce himself so I don't miss anything important.
Thank you so much, Luke. Good to be here. Hi, everyone. So, John Horgan, I am a professor of psychology at Georgia State University, as Luke says. And psychology is the study of you and me. It is more specifically, it's the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. And the intersection that Luke just referred to about psychology and terrorism, I suppose, is what sort of has defined my professional career to this point, which is I'm interested in what psychology has to say about terrorism and even more specifically than that, the people who get involved in it and how and why and all of those sorts of things that go along with that.
Excellent. Thank you. So there's a few topics that I want to cover today. Um, we'll talk about who becomes a terrorist and why they leave terrorist movements, how individuals become radicalized, why they join groups or decide to go off on their own and act as lone wolves, as we say in the research space. But first, I kind of want to knock out some of the big picture items. So first, John, how does your training as a psychologist influence your definition of terrorism?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I don't know that my training as a psychologist affects my definition. I mean, the definition of terrorism that I use is a very slight, ever so slight variation on a really excellent one that Randy Borum put out in 2011, I think it was. And there's nothing inherently psychological or psychology specific in that definition. But I think if I was to give you an answer to that, it probably would be that psychology as a discipline has taught me to respect evidence. It's taught me to respect rigor, consistency, being systematic, and what that means in terms of choosing or embracing a definition of terrorism means you have to stand by that definition if something happens and you are asked to either characterize it as terrorism or something else. And that is easier said than done, I think, particularly in this day and age when we are starting to see blurred lines between non-ideological and ideological acts of extreme violence that's sort of getting us to reconsider our own definition. So I think what psychology has given me as far as the definition is concerned is probably a healthy a healthy need to or healthy reminder rather to be consistent and rigorous in any definition that I use. So if I use a definition, I'm just not putting it out there willy-nilly for the benefit of others. I'm saying this is what I am willing to stand by as how I think about terrorism and how I characterize it. And that
And
consistency is critical.
yeah, absolutely. So, how did you end up getting interested in terrorism as a phenomenon? Because typically, when people think of somebody who's trained in the discipline of psychology, they don't typically think of them crossing over to, something that could seem radically different. Uh, the two areas of study sometimes might not be even considered on the same spectrum. So, what interested you in terrorism as a phenomenon? What made you want to study it?
For sure. And before I forget it, I think, Luke, they're still not considered on the same spectrum. I mean, I think I'm biased, obviously. I think psychology has so much potential for the study of terrorism, but there's still so few people involved in terrorism studies from psychology as a discipline that, we've got a lot of work to do. But to answer your question, um, I like to tell people that it's a happy accident. I think certainly a lot of people, particularly here in the States, think that, oh yeah, you're born and raised in Ireland, you must have been affected or impacted by the Troubles in some way, and that's sort of what got you into it. And then short answer is not at all. I grew up in the Republic of Ireland in County Kerry. Um, uh, it may as well have been a million miles away from the Troubles. I was never impacted by it or affected by it. My family was non-political. I didn't really take an interest in terrorism until I got to college, and uh, how I got to college is another story. But I ended up doing a majoring in psychology, and it just so happened that one of my professors, Max Taylor, a brilliant psychologist, and also happened to be a terrorism expert, and he probably not happy with me saying this, but he would come to class and just always wanted to talk about terrorism. So no matter what concept I had him for social psychology, and no matter what concept in social psychology, whether it was the idea of, well, sometimes we do things in groups that we wouldn't normally do on our own, or in order to engage in an act of extreme violence, you don't necessarily have to suffer from some pathology. Very often, it's the product of a certain type of process, or it's a thousand little steps, etc. Max would pepper those concepts with examples from terrorism, and it was almost like what psychologists call it a flashbulb memory, where you can remember exactly where you were, exactly how you felt when you heard a certain thing for the first time. He talked about people who engaged in acts of horrific violence from one person to another or against another, and he just laid out the process. He laid out the sort of the basic tenets of social psychology, the effects of being in a group, and how being in a group can sometimes change us in ways that allows us to be a bit more open to doing things we wouldn't normally do. And just hearing that being laid out for the first time, I mean, it was my mind was blown from that. And I think that's kind of what got me interested in the terrorism area, because I was just obsessed with it from then on. And I was in the second year of my undergraduate degree, and for good or for bad, I just haven't been able to shake it since.
Yeah, I understand. I had a similar sort of journey towards this area of study. Um, so with that, I kind of want to get down to, the meat and potatoes of our discussion today. Um, and I think what we should start to focus on now, is the people, because I think that's one of the more important aspects of this topic is the people who become involved in terrorism. So, based on your research and experience, who becomes a terrorist? And relatedly, an important concept that you bring up in your latest book is who does not become a terrorist.
Yeah.
So, through your experience and research, um, who occupies those two sort of strata? Who becomes a terrorist and who does not?
Yeah, well, so the answer is changing, and I probably would give a different answer today than I would have even 10 years ago. And thanks for mentioning the recent book. I mean, I think the question that really it's been a driving force in the research that I've done for the past 25 years now, and it's sort of one of the things that sort of keeps me involved in this research isn't so much how and why do people become terrorists. It's why is it that so few people become involved? I mean, that's really the question here, because there's no shortage of sources of grievances out there. There's no shortage of reasons, big reasons, small reasons, big ideologies, little personal private stories and private things that sort of explain why there would be a readiness for more and more people to get involved in this stuff, but so few do. Of those that do, we know that they do have certain things in common. I used to say for years and years and years, there's no profile. Um, that's not technically correct, and I sort of qualified myself a little bit more carefully in the recent book. There are profiles, and we can construct them, but they just don't tend to last very long. They don't have much staying power. So, for example, in the past, it would not have been a controversial thing to say that with exceptions, your quote unquote average terrorist was going to be a young, angry, alienated male aged 18 to 24. A number of problems with that today, because I think today terrorism has become an equal opportunities employer. We see men, women, children from all ages, all backgrounds, all religious creeds, etc., becoming involved for on the one hand all different kinds of reasons, getting involved in all different kinds of ways, fulfilling a wider variety of different roles and functions than ever before, and ending up being changed in very fundamental different sorts of ways. One of my PhD students, Katerina Meredith, is finishing just a really tremendous piece of research right now on how the experiences of being in these groups changes people. So to go back to directed to your question, Luke, we know about who becomes involved. It really, that there are things they have in common. We also used to say back in the day, well, anyone at any time or any place could become involved. I'm no longer sure that that's necessarily the case, despite the fact that, we see diversity is now a defining feature of who gets involved today. It's not for everyone. There are people who, they go down the radicalization pathway and they start to toy with ideas and they start to cross over. And they might set out with ideas or fantasies about what it means to be involved. And then the first time they sort of dip a toe in the water, reality has a way of biting people pretty harshly. And then they decide it's not quite for them, or rather, that specific role isn't for them. And some of the more effective organizations or movements out there. I'm talking about, well, way back in the day would have been the provisional IRA. These days, we'd be looking at more about the experiences of movements and organizations like ISIS and how they basically catered to a much, much, much wider variety of person than ever before. I always remember the video, propaganda video that was I don't know, was it authored by, but it was certainly narrated by the Canadian Muslim convert Andre Poulain, who said to his Western viewers, "There is a role for everybody." And some of the more effective tuned in groups will be very, very sensitive to that. So it will allow them to pull on different kinds of people from different kinds of backgrounds for different kinds of reasons to fulfill different sorts of roles.
Now, is
So
that
I'm
yeah,
giving you a very long-winded answer to
yeah.
your question, but we see more diversity than ever before, and what they have in common, there's at least four themes that have come out in my research. They are sensitive to some injustice or grievance that they identify with very, very closely, such that it's not just paying attention to it. There is a very deep and profound sense of moral outrage that this injustice has been done. They don't shy away from it. They look at it head on, and they decide either on their own or with the help of somebody that they want to do something about it. Another common feature, of course, unsurprisingly, is that they come to view, either on their own or with the help of someone, violence as being the only acceptable, morally, ethically, etc., response to that injustice. So the way to right that wrong, ironically, because terrorism is full of contradictions, is to simply engage in more violence in order to challenge what has already been done. There's a sense of urgency, and sometimes that has to do with a recruiter playing a role, or an ideological tract that is shaping or giving direction or meaning to what the new recruit is experiencing. But the sense of, you need to act now rather than later, because if you don't act now, well, it will be too late, and the enemy will have won. So those are fairly broad commonalities, but and the bad news is, of course, is that there's practically zero predictive ability or capacity rather in any of those.
Yeah. And would you say that what you just described holds true across ideologies, whether it's far right, Islamist, far left, anything along those lines?
Yes, is the simple answer to that. Yeah. So this is, um, and I don't claim to have, the answers to the psychology of terrorism because I'm sure if you had people like Randy
Hmm.
or Art Kruglansky, other people who do this kind of work on, we would give you slightly different perspectives on things, and we might give you vastly different theoretical perspectives on things. But for me, my psychology of terrorism and the way I understand it has to be informed by going across the spectrum from, because, at the end of the day, people are people. And it is the same human psychology that governs us all. I think it is easy to be distracted and sometimes misled by ideology. Ideology is critically important, but it's just one of several factors that are at play here. And it's just so easy to be distracted by ideology to assume that these groups and the people who make up these groups are so different from each other. But the reality is there is more in they have more in common than the ideological surface differences might suggest. Of course, you're talking about different causes, you're talking about different ideologies, different places, and all of those things really do matter. But at the end of the day, when you either pay close attention to the things people say or write, or in some cases we have the rare opportunity to actually sit down with them and listen to their stories. If we can ask the right questions and in the right way, and if we do a good job of just shutting up and listening to them, the stories start to become a lot more similar than they are different. So
And I think that raises a really valuable point, because I kind of liken this to what Robert Paxton wrote about fascism in his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, is that it can't be replicated, um, you know, in every instance. You can't really draw a lot of these conclusions. You can't come up with a blueprint for fascism because it differs so widely by time and place. And I think that's a valuable, sort of connection to make between the two sort of concepts that we're discussing here.
absolutely, yeah, and it is a perfect time to talk about fascism. But I think who was it that said? I think it was Brian Jenkins used to say terrorism is a product of its own time and place, and so it's
Yes,
all
yeah.
about context. There's no doubt about it. It's all about context. And one of the many reasons I'm still so fascinated by terrorism and so engaged in the study of it is that we can't study terrorism from the perspective of one discipline alone. And for some people, I mean that's less of a challenge and more of a just sort of a source of frustration. But I've learned so much from listening to historians and anthropologists and sociologists and religious studies experts because
Mhm.
you really do get a sense of that context by looking at terrorism from disciplines that are not our own. So
Yeah,
so I
it's
think we can we
yeah.
can we can as people like to say here, I mean, we can chew gum and walk at the same time. We have to appreciate that context is everything, and at the same time, there are themes. If we do this research rigorously, and we can do comparative research, which requires the sorts of resources through large scale funding that is at risk right now. We can start to see that even across ideologies that might be fundamentally contradictory, if not completely opposites, polar opposites, the similarities really still do emerge from those. And that's where the devil is in the details. It's by listening to the words people use, listening to their accounts, listening to how people make sense of the world. If you strip away the ideology just for a second, you'll start to see that the similarities outweigh the differences every single time.
Yeah, excellent point. So now that we've kind of spoken about who becomes a terrorist and who doesn't, I think a very salient topic that we should discuss now is, the topic of radicalization, and the different pathways that people become radicalized to the point of committing acts of violence. Um, so, is there a typical radicalization pathway that one takes to becoming a terrorist? And do we, or should we, differentiate between the pathway one takes to radicalizing in thought versus practice?
Mhm.
So, somebody can radicalize to the point of becoming a nonviolent individual, or they can, choose to act on their radicalization and become violent.
Yeah.
Um, so, what do you make of those sorts of ideas and questions?
For sure, yeah. So for a start, there's no singular pathway. There are multiple pathways in, multiple pathways through groups, and then multiple pathways out. It's easy to get bogged down in the complexity of it all and say, well, all right, but that is the reality of it. One of the things that I try to do in my research is to sort of illuminate the diversity of pathways on the one hand, but to try to see what are some of the social and psychological qualities associated with those diverse pathways. And again, that's where you start to see more similarities than differences. So the pathways might, you and I might get involved in the same movement in fundamentally different ways. You might want to go and be part of a physical group in person. But for me, the extent of my involvement might stop at being extremely online all the time. It doesn't mean that my involvement is any less meaningful to me. It's just different, and your experience is going to be different. It's going to feel different to mine. But we might have gotten involved in different ways. We might have gotten our ideas about what it means to get involved in fundamentally different ways. I think trying to focus on and trying to illuminate the qualities of the pathways is where we really start to see the light here. And that's where we see that, despite how people get involved and how they get involved, it's still a gradual process. It's, again, in the words of a former terrorist, it is 1,000 little steps. We hear so much these days about, people becoming radicalized overnight and things like that. It doesn't really happen like that. I haven't seen any convincing evidence that people radicalize that quickly. It tends to be, I mean, some people do get involved at a faster rate than others, but it tends to be a fairly gradual process of working out ideas and trying to figure out what it means for me or those around me, should I decide to go down a particular pathway. Now, when it comes to radicalization and mobilization and things like that, I think we need to set a few things straight. So some of it is, I think, non-controversial. I mean, we know for a fact, we've known for a long time, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of people who hold radical, even extreme views are never going to mobilize to action. Okay, I think that's a fairly uncontroversial thing to say, but it needs to be said because from a policy perspective, we spend so much time trying to think about how to prevent radicalization, we're just missing the mark. The second part of this, which I think has really come out in some exciting research over the past 10 to 15 years, is that even people who decide to cross over, even people who mobilize to violence, aren't necessarily people who have fully worked out ideas.
Mhm.
Some do. I mean, I think the assumption that a lot of us have about how this stuff works is we're just going about our business, and through some complex combination of things, big picture issues, small picture, what's going on in my life right now, I am deemed to be vulnerable to certain ideas that if I embrace those ideas might set me on a particular pathway to terrorism. For some people, that is certainly the case. But we're seeing an awful lot of complexity and an awful lot of diversity in the different cases, and they're very heterogeneous, which is just a fancy way of saying they're all very different. Um, um, Radicalization to me is really not the problem here. I think we've gotten a little bit off track, and that is not in any way to cast negative light on the tremendous research that's been done over the past 10, 15, 2 decades on radicalization. I just think that we could be researching radicalization for the next 30 years, and it's not necessarily going to bring us any closer to understanding the people who decide to cross over. Because for me, the challenge is not understanding radicalization, which I think is not that hard to understand anymore. It's mobilization.
Hmm.
What is it that distinguishes the person who engages in radical thought and will try to work out these ideas and and if the opportunity presents themselves, act on them. But acting on them might mean having a discussion with like-minded people, or even going on a protest, or doing things like that. But that is a very, very, very far cry from the person who decides that violence is not just the appropriate next step, but that it's the appropriate next step for me. And that's the $64 million question we have, as far as the sort of the not just the psychology of terrorism research, but the very, very narrow sliver of it that we occupy.
Now, I think that's a really good segue to another question that's come up, within the field, because I'm sure that a lot of the practitioners who have joined this discussion today are probably familiar with Fatali Moghadam's, staircase to terrorism. I became aware of that during grad school when I used that as a model to sort of compare the radicalization pathways or the mobilization pathways between, Timothy McVeigh and Anders Breivik. Um, I found that, their pathways were similar. Um, Now, aside from the staircase model, there's also the pyramid model, or I think it's the two pyramid model that you sort of speak about in Terrorist Minds. Do you find utility in some of these models of radicalization?
To an extent, I do, and I should say that the two pyramid model is not mine. That's I talk about it, but it is
Yeah.
it's proposed by Clark Macaulay and Sofia Moskalenko. And so, yeah, they originally proposed a single pyramid, and then they revised it with a double pyramid model. So, yeah, so I in the book, I mean, I do discuss the sort of the merits of all of these models, and sometimes, Luke, it's modeled with a capital M, and sometimes it's modeled with a small m. I think sometimes they're proper full-on models, sometimes they're conceptual frameworks, sometimes they're a little more than analogies or metaphors. Um, are they useful? I think they can be. And I will echo one of my colleagues here who said, well, they can be useful, particularly for practitioners and policymakers who want, you know, maybe they don't necessarily want to hear that it's complex. I mean, it is complex, and I don't shy away from that. For me, the challenge is how to simplify that complexity without shying away from the fact that on the ground, I mean, and looking at these cases from eye level, they are complicated and they are complex. But models can be useful because they simplify a complex process into something that's easy to remember and gives us a ready way to think about it. Where I get a little bit persnickety about it is that sometimes, those models can lead us into thinking that the process is simpler than it is.
Hmm.
And and in turn, that can lead to some pretty poorly informed policy making or practice. So that I'm very familiar with Fithali's model, and there are others like it, like a conveyor belt. And in a way, not to denigrate any of my colleagues, but in a way, all of these models are just variations on a theme. There's this assumption that you once you get on a particular path, there's a sort of a sequence of steps that are in interdependent order, and some evidence bears that out, but very often it does not. And I think today we're seeing those models being challenged in ways that we haven't seen before. But any good model is going to be subject to revision. So yeah, they are useful, but to a point.
Yeah, and that sort of brings up a question that I had not previously planned to ask, but I think one of the maybe and respectfully might be a shortcoming of some of these models is that they don't always necessarily account for the ability for somebody to get off the staircase at any one point within that process or within the steps within that model. So I think that might be, an area for future scholars, researchers to kind of take into account. And with that being said, I think it's important that we also discuss the ways in which people leave terrorism.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
you sort of bifurcate between the ideas of de-radicalization and disengagement. Um, so how are those two concepts different, and how do they apply to individuals leaving terrorism, or leaving radical thought behind?
Sure. So they are related but distinct terms, and I think some people use them interchangeably, and I think that's a mistake. So all right. So brass tacks. I mean, when I disengagement just means stopping what you're doing. Okay, and the reason I became, I developed these terms and started to, use them in my research, is that I saw that people were leaving terrorist groups behind, or they were stopping their involvement in a particular role. And then I naively assumed way back in the day, I mean, I was like 2002 or three when I started really first thinking about this stuff. I found that I assumed that when people left these roles, that they would somehow leave behind the ideology that went with it. And it turned out that they were, just as committed and dedicated to the cause as than ever before, but others weren't. So I thought, well, okay, well, some people, when they leave, they hold on to these views and others don't. So de-radicalization, on the other hand, well, it actually means two things. I mean, first of all, it implies a sort of and a movement away from the ideals or the ideas or the ideology or the cause. And those things are not necessarily synonymous with each other, but it means a change in views, a change in a perspective, as opposed to a change in behavior. Sometimes people disengage and they de-radicalize, so they get out and
Hmm.
they decide, well, this is just not for me anymore. And it might actually have been that it was the de-radicalization that preceded the disengagement. Others leave and they just hold on to those views. So I think that's why I say that they are related but distinct, because we have different possibility, we have different combinations of things that can happen there. And the other meaning of the term de-radicalization is that it is a term that is used to describe a fairly fairly loosely knit cottage industry of initiatives around the world now that seek to get people on those off ramps, or prevent people going back into terrorism once they've already come out. So you hear of de-radicalization programs. So.
Yeah. And I think that's a great segue into my next question or topic that I'd like to discuss is that what you said, cottage industry of these programs of de-radicalization and prevention. Um, so based on, some of your writing, your research, your professional experience, I know that, based in your last book, Terrorist Minds, you actually had the opportunity to experience some of these programs firsthand in Saudi. So can you talk about these programs as a whole, um, on its face? Like, what is the value in them? How effective are they? And then how can you compare your experience with the Saudi one to, I don't know, maybe others that you've had the chance to
Sure.
experience or interact
Yeah.
with?
Okay, so I'll do my best to remember three questions there. So I think the value, Luke, is that so these programs are, they're some are big, some are small, some are
Hmm.
Saudi is, astronomically well resourced, and then there are other ones where they're literally run by one or two people. Um, uh, what they have in common is that they are trying to reduce the risk in their own way of people returning or re-engaging in terrorism for reasons that we don't fully understand. And there are more knowledgeable people like Mary Beth Altier out there who know a lot more about terrorism, terrorist recidivism. But for reasons that we don't fully understand yet, the recidivism rate to terrorism is actually very, very low, irrespective of whether or not someone has participated in a de-radicalization program. I have seen firsthand in places like Pakistan, where in the Swat Valley, for example, where programs can be tremendously effective.
Hmm.
If you put my scholar hat on me now, if you said, well, what's your answer to are they effective? The short answer is it's hard to say because these programs for all kinds of reasons, don't easily lend themselves to evaluation. They either don't want to be evaluated, or they're not in a place where they are, at least in their minds, open to that yet. So sometimes, I mean, researchers like myself get an opportunity to go and see these programs firsthand, and we see up close and personal just how much of a difference it makes in the lives of people who've been affected by terrorism and their families. And you don't even have to go to Saudi or Pakistan. I mean, there are organizations here, NGOs, community-based groups like Parents for Peace, for example, that I've
Hmm.
worked with closely for a few years now. And they are doing the hard work of having these conversations with people who are involved in violent extremism, and they're trying to get them out. So, and I wouldn't characterize Parents for Peace as a de-radicalization initiative. I think unfortunately, it's a word that has just too much baggage associated with it now. But some of these programs are very effective. Others are, quite frankly, smoke and mirrors, where um, uh, yes, there is an effect in the sense that the person is not going back into terrorism, but is it because the program has contributed to them having a change in outlook, or is it because the program, quite frankly, is buying them off or is setting them up with a house or an apartment or a spouse or a job or something like that? I mean, are you really de-radicalizing someone, or are you simply substituting the person's time with things that will otherwise keep them busy? So a lot of these programs, and sometimes with very good reason, still exist in the shadows. They are trying to do very, very difficult work, often with meager resources. But ironically, it's some of the bigger, more public or publicized programs are the ones that have I look at them and go, I'm not entirely sure that you are doing exactly what you're claiming to do here.
Hmm. So what makes the most effective programs that you've seen work?
The short answer is it's going to depend because people are going to need different things. One of the driving assumptions in the early days of the DRAD programs was that, well, they have to be primarily based around addressing the ideology. And then the question became, well, who's the right person to have that ideological discussion? Are we talking about a
Yeah.
religious figure, or are we talking
Hmm.
about a social worker? Are we talking about a fellow traveler who has sort of walked the walk, talked the talk, and can get in there and have this discussion? And the answer is it might be all of those, or it might be none of them, depending on A, whether the person is even ideological. Because a person might have, and this is why we pay attention to people's trajectories and pathways. A person might have gotten in because their friend was involved, and they just allowed themselves to drift into this lifestyle, but they remain involved in it because the ideology got a hold on them. There are other people who get in because the ideology is the driver. That's the thing that really excites them. And then they get in and they realize, well, pardon my French, but it's a crock of shit. But what keeps them in there is the camaraderie and the excitement and the sense of belonging to something and being part of something that is much bigger than me and much bigger than something that I could ever be part of on my own. And that is a very, very compelling thing that keeps people in there. So all of that is to say, if that person gets to a point in their life when they decide they want to get out because they're disillusioned, having an ideological discussion with them is going to be a waste of time because it's going to be irrelevant for them. The true, and this is one of the reasons that that sort of attracted me to partnering with Parents for Peace on some of the work that we've done. The true work that organizations like that do is one-on-one interactions with people. It's as much about listening as it is talking, and it's figuring out what are the person's needs. What do they need if they're going to effectively reintegrate? And I can pretty much assure you, fulfilling ideological needs comes way, 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 way down the list.
Yeah. All excellent points. Um, so we've kind of worked through a lot of the chronological steps. We talk about who becomes a terrorist or who doesn't, how they become involved in it, what radicalizes them, and what gets them to leave. Um, so when we talk about this process or a terrorist life cycle, if you will, um, what happens to these people when they either de-radicalize or disengage? How well do they integrate back into society?
Mhm.
We already talked a little bit about that, but I want to hit on this as a broader phenomenon. Um, so, what do we do with these folks who have, dedicated parts of their lives, or maybe
Yeah,
a vast majority of their lives, to these extreme causes?
yeah. Well, there is a view, and it's a widely held view that, well, when people have served their prison sentences, what business do we have doing anything with them? We at least last I checked, we still have First Amendment protections in this country, and so as ugly or unconscionable, the views that people still might have post incarceration, what business? So the argument goes, what business do we have being concerned about those views? I think it's a question that's sort of 50 shades of gray, right? Because when do unacceptable views slide into ideology, and then when does ideology start to come up? When does it start to cozy up with a potential involvement? Again, I'll go back to my earlier point. We know that, again, for reasons we don't fully understand, but the recidivism rate is significantly lower among terrorist offenders than it is for so-called ordinary decent criminals. Some people get out, they still feel strongly about the cause to which they dedicated part of their lives, and so they might renew that interest, but their involvement has shifted, so they're no longer engaged in violence or anything close to that, but they might still play a role in spreading the message or distributing propaganda or fulfilling some role. I mean, even in the smallest of groups, there's a wide variety of roles that people can engage in, and the vast majority of them are not violent. So people can still remain involved. Others get out or others, when they do get out, they are both disengaged and de-radicalized, and they just have no more interest in it. And for some people, it's crisis. It's a realization that, well, is this what I've given my life for? And they find themselves socially, psychologically adrift. They have cut ties from the group that they were once part of, or the movement, and they equally find themselves isolated forever from family and friends from whom they have cut ties before they got in and started that journey. So people can find themselves in tremendous crisis afterwards. Sometimes people will. I mean, it's all kind of. I mean, it's the pathways out and the experiences post involvement are as numerous as the pathways in the first place. Sometimes they will talk to researchers like myself or my graduate students. Sometimes they will just form a new identity and they never want to talk about this stuff ever again.
Yes, all good points. So I think that'll kind of end the formal portion, formal question and answer portion of today's event. And we have some questions from our audience that we will now be taking and answering. So one question is there any evidence for enablers and constraints of mobilization towards violence? So is there anything that might accelerate somebody's mobilization or something that might slow it down?
Yes, there is. There's some really, really good research on both of those things. So, in terms of mobilization to violence, I'm actually going to point you to a non-academic source, the National Counterterrorism Center's radicalization and mobilization indicators has done a very, very good job of capturing what those mobilization indicators are. And it's to use a sort of a cooking analogy for a minute, it's a sort of it's a long list of ingredients, and not every ingredient is going to go into every single case, but it's a pretty exhaustive list of things. So look that up. It's an open source a document I widely draw on when I do talk about some of this stuff for law enforcement and other practitioners. I would also strongly urge you to look at some of the work that the FBI has put out. There is an absolutely phenomenal report that the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU1, that looks at terrorism and counterterrorism. They've just put out a report called Beyond Belief,
Hmm.
and I've pushed it out on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. But it is one of the best pieces I have seen in my 25 years plus doing research on terrorism that talks about the enablers, the obstacles, the facilitators for mobilization. And if you want more academic sources, I mean, I can just shoot me an email and I can point you in the direction of the work of people like Joel Busher and others. So.
Excellent. Um, so when you examine the overlapping ideologies of certain lone actor attackers, often kind of referred to as salad bar extremism, where these individuals take, certain ideological ingredients, again, to use a cooking analogy, from maybe jihadism, neo-Nazism, or anything like that. Um, do you think that researching extreme beliefs or extreme overvalued beliefs can enhance our understanding of terrorism?
Unquestionably, there's no doubt about it. I think what we so again, I mean, I'm not saying that we should ignore this at all. I'm simply saying that it's only one part of the puzzle. The thing that I've been unhappy about in the past when it comes to ideology, I have never said that ideology isn't relevant. I've said that we are too preoccupied with figuring out the content of the ideology. Is it this? Is it that? Is it this ideology? Is it that? And as you say, Luke, we're seeing so much convergence now. David Garnstein Ross calls it composite violent extremism. I call it um, um, ideological promiscuity. There's a whole bunch of
Hmm.
terms. I'm not convinced we're talking about the same thing exactly, but that's a whole nother conversation. But um, um, what we are missing is a sense of what the meaning of this ideology or ideologies is to the person. And not to keep going back to the book, but the reason I finished the book with a sort of a manifesto of sorts to re-embrace the individual level ideographic research, where we guess what we would learn if we actually listen to people. We lack a clear sense of what the meaning of these ideologies is for the people who consume them and construct them. So we know that there is a currency in trading in and sort of drawing on ideologies. But what we're seeing these days, we're seeing people pick and choose their own ideologies for sure. But we're seeing it go in different sorts of ways. We're seeing people who they are real deal ideologically motivated offenders. So they might be embracing Nazism. They are embracing anti-Semitism, but they're also looking at ecological concerns. And so we would call them eco-fascists.
Hmm.
A term popularized by Brenton Tarrant and those who came before him. So we see people wrestle with how to make their different things fit together. And sometimes it's about mashing those jigsaw puzzle pieces together in a way that requires a bit of force. But others have decided for whatever grievance they have that isn't necessarily connected to the ideology, they have decided that they want to commit an act of extreme violence. And then they decide to try to figure out what worldview might be consistent with that would at least elevate their act to a different kind of significance. But why they do that specifically, I think, is a bit of a puzzle. But answer the question that was asked, absolutely, we should be paying close attention to it. But let's not get caught up in, well, what's the difference between this kind of neo-Nazism versus that kind of. We can do that all day long. It's not going to bring us any closer to figuring out what is the attraction to the person. Because sometimes it's about the ideology, and quite frankly, what I'm seeing an awful lot of via the school shootings research that we're doing right now is sometimes it's not about the ideology or the message per se, it's about the aesthetic, It's the style. It is stunning to me that Brenton Tarrant, a white nationalist from Australia, who sought to and did kill Muslims in New Zealand, he is still radicalizing and mobilizing young people all over the United States to do what he did. But is it the message? Is it the xenophobia? Is it the eco-fascism in total, in part, or what I'm seeing is that it's the aesthetic, it's the first person perspective, that sense of immersion that he gave fellow travelers by live streaming it from a first person perspective. That is the thing that seems to be driving kids' curiosity with seeking out this material in the first place. So all of that is to say that this is why we have a hard time. People make fun of academics for saying, well, it's all complex, blah, blah, blah. Well, it is because it's easy in hindsight to figure out what all of these factors are. It's so easy to do this in hindsight, but mapping, reverse engineering the sequence such that it has predictive ability is hard, if not impossible to do.
Yes. Do you think youths who are chiefly radicalized online, or those, i.e., those with very little support networks, have a need to exaggerate and fantasize their commitment and self-importance?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Sometimes it's just about being a low-key member of the community, and I've seen this um, um, wholesale when it comes to the incel community, which is far more diverse than I thought when I first started, looking at incels. So no, I mean, it's that there isn't a sort of a driving need to sort of be more than. For some, it's just being a lurker, let alone an active participant in online fora. It fills that gap. It just addresses that. It pushes away that loneliness, just for a few more hours or one more night.
And how do you think that compares to individuals in locations that have direct contact with some of these militant networks, let's say,
Yeah.
Syria, Iraq, any of those countries where we've seen a lot of that?
That goes right back to a question you asked me about 20 minutes ago, which is about, well, are there different pathways? That is a perfect illustration of that because, and again, the experience might be no less meaningful to the individual, but what it means to be involved is going to look and feel very, very different to the person who is 4,000 miles away and either wants to get over or is told, well, no, don't because you're probably going to get caught. And so, stay at home, do something there, and we can help you figure out what that might be, versus the person who is, locally recruited and likely is being driven by a different immediate local grievance that matters in a way that is going to be different. It's probably going to be different to the narrative that's being used to sort of groom the person from 4 or 5 thousand miles away.
Yes, and I think that's a good segue into the next question that I'd like to ask from the audience, is how important are prior experiences in an individual's life to their ascension or joining in terrorist groups? I know that when I was in grad school, I had a professor who would pretty consistently say that in a lot of the cases in which he interviewed some of these people, that there was some life event that was usually embarrassing or shameful in
Yeah.
nature that sort of was not necessarily the Kickstarter, but it was a factor in their ascension into either joining a group or committing an act of terrorist violence.
I
Um,
see no convincing evidence that there was some sort of, major formative catalytic event that drives people into this. It's easy with hindsight to pull things out, but this is why we do triangulation. This is why we look at biographical data. This is why in the limited cases we try to talk to people just to sort of figure out if these things were as important in reality as we think. That's not to say that formative events don't matter. Of course they do. I mean, we're talking about everything from just life experiences to predispositions. The way those things tend to come out, they tend to come out in all phases of the arc of terrorism. But sometimes they might predispose someone to a particular kind of role or a particular outlet. Back in the day, I was very fond of saying that, anyone at the right place at the right time can become involved in terrorism. I don't say that anymore because I've reversed that position, and I've argued against that now in the recent book, because terrorism is not for everybody. And sometimes you don't realize that until you get in there and you're asked to do something and you find that, well, either you don't have the stomach for it or the fortitude for it, or you're not willing to allow yourself to do it and see what happens. So there, like I said, there are people who drift in and then they dip a toe in the water and they decide, well, this is not quite for me. I still am just as committed and I want to do something, but I want to express my involvement in a different way. And that's very often a reflection of personality or predisposition or something else. And let's not overlook the obvious formative experiences. I mean, if you happen to be an electrical engineer, chances are you're not going to be gravitating towards a role in fundraising. So, if there are skills, knowledge that you bring with you, an effective group or a competent movement will recognize that you can fulfill a need here that will draw on that. Whether you like it or not, it's a different story.
Yeah, precisely. You see that with a lot of some of these more artistically minded
Yeah,
folks that will do propaganda. They will do video editing. They will do posters,
yeah.
something along those lines. They're not necessarily out there committing a suicide attack or committing a mass shooting, but they are contributing to the cause in some aspect.
For sure, and
Um,
there are, so it's harder to see this at a basic individual level, but I mean there are sometimes, of course, big formative events, whether it's, I just finished watching the TV adaptation of Say Nothing, the Patrick Radden Keefe book about Northern Ireland, which was really tremendous. And sort of, it's easy to look back on an event like Bloody Sunday to see how that, essentially overnight radicalized an entire Republican population in Northern Ireland, let alone Belfast. But in terms of individual histories, yeah, sometimes we see evidence of big picture things that happen, but no sort of immediate, catalyst that explains it all.
yes. So given the interest of time, we have time remaining for one question from the audience, and this is one that I'm ashamed to have said that I did not have on my list of questions. So thank you to this audience member for pointing this out. So we obviously need to talk about the intersection of mental illness or mental health issues and terrorism.
Yeah.
So oftentimes the idea of sociopathy comes through in terrorism or extremism more generally. So this question asks, do you think extremists are sociopaths on some level?
No is the short answer. Now, in some of the bigger movements, I mean, statistically, you're going to find people who do exhibit sociopathic or in the old days we call them psychopathic tendencies. I'm going to say something which might seem very challenging, and I'm saying it as I realize we got less than 2 minutes to go, but um, to be an effective terrorist, to walk away from your family, to go off and pursue a dream in the name of some group that you might not be familiar with, or cause or ideology that you might still have a distant connection to. You need to be the opposite of a psychopath. You need to be, believe it or not, you need to be capable of demonstrating empathy, because you are going to be required to sacrifice potentially yourself, potentially your own life in the name of a cause that you don't yet fully understand. The literature in the 70s and 80s, and even up until early 1990s, was still very fond of this hypothesis that because of what terrorists do, they must be psychopathic at some level. The available evidence suggests that's not the case. Now, that is not to say that mental illness and terrorism is a sort of a done debate. It's clearly not. Mental illness it can often be a consequence of spending time in these movements. And that's something that, people like Daniel Kohler have drawn attention to in recent years.
Hmm.
Karina Meredith's research on this, and there are others who've talked about it. And I think we need to know a lot more about just how the process of being in these groups can itself be a source of trauma. And obviously, people like Paul Gill have drawn attention to the role of mental illness in present, not necessarily driving, but present in some types of terrorism. So we see more evidence for mental illness in the backgrounds of people who choose to become lone actors than
Mm.
than involved in groups. We're not entirely sure why, but we know that that is there's a more detectable effect in certain buckets of terrorists than others. And
Oh,
whether
very
that's
interesting.
that groups and movements do a good job or better job of weeding people out, we just don't know. A lot more
Yeah.
research than there,
Yeah, because that can oftentimes end up being, potentially a liability for, especially in a group setting or in a small cell setting where somebody might be mentally unstable, and they sort of foil their plan or their plans going forward.
for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And with that being said, unfortunately, we have run out of time for today's event. I would like to thank Dr. John Horgan for joining us today and taking time out of his day to grace us with his, expert knowledge on terrorism and psychology and speaking to this very important and salient intersection of these two areas of study. So, John, where can folks find your work?
I was going to say available at all good bookstores, but we don't have bookstores anymore. So yeah, well, you can certainly email me for research papers, but my book is Terrorist Minds, published by Columbia University Press, and you can either get it through them or wherever you get your books. Yeah, and thank you.
Excellent.
This was a
All
lot of
right.
fun.
So,
Thank you so much.
absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for joining today, and we will see you next time.